Okay. Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to say thank you to Chippie for joining us today. Before we go, I just wanted to introduce a little bit about our initiative at Open Field Collective, and then we can start with Chippie's much-awaited webinar here. So basically we are a cohort which is spread in India, US, and Bangladesh at this point of time. And we call ourselves Open Field Collective because we want to solve problems in an open and a collaborative manner. So this is some pictures of our cohort from our workshop. And currently our project, which is funded by National Geographic and the ASCB Compass Outreach Grant, it's about monitoring algal blooms in freshwater bodies. And in order to do that, we have been tackling this problem in a frugal and in a citizen science manner. So this is our team here. Iqbal, Sayak, Ankita, Kanika, Ankit. What the tools we have been using during our workshop. So one, what you see here on the top is like the foldscope or the paper microscope. So we're using that to identify what kind of algae are present in the freshwater bodies. And then we are using spectrophotometer to quantify what are the abundance of these species in these freshwater bodies. And I think one of the things that going forward is like what kind of more tools and techniques we can integrate into our program. And that's why I think like Chippie's webinar today will be really eye-opening for us, because we want to see if we can actually make some frugal drones to monitor the concentration of these, or those kind of algae which are present in these water bodies. Just some of the pictures from our cohort who have been going out in the field, collecting water samples and identifying different species of algae, as you can see here. And we also have this database which we got from Professor John Kinross about where we have categorized all the different kinds of algae alphabetically. And then on our website, you can also find all different resources, so our videos, any important links, protocols, and basically everything we've been doing this workshop so that it's very easy for any other cohort, if they want to replicate any of these, they could also do that. And if anybody wants to write to us, to collaborate or something, we're very happy to do that. And with this, I would like to introduce Chippie Kislik, who is, Chippie Kislik, who is a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley in Professor Maggie Kelly's lab. And previously, she was a manager of the Develop program at NASA Ames Research Center and a Fulbright researcher in Ecuador. And she has been using satellite imagery and GIS to conduct studies of harmful algal blooms, monitoring water quality, the forest health, and fire risk in different parts. And she's also the recipient of National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship. And apart from research, Chippie enjoys engaging in environmental education, hiking, whistling, speaking Spanish, and also watching good Wes Anderson movies. And I'm also a huge fan of Wes Anderson. So really nice to have you, Chippie, here. And we're excited to hear from you. And I'm sure the cohort which are not present right now because of schools or classes, they will be able to catch up with recordings. And if there are any follow-up questions as to how we can get into some frugal drones in our initiative, we'll be happy to talk to you more and get some questions and answers from you. Thank you so much. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Perfect. All right, I will share mine. So let's see, can you see my slides now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for that very sweet introduction. Hi, everybody. My name is Chippie Kislik, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of California, Berkeley. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Today, I'm going to talk about how drones can be used for algal bloom monitoring. As an overview, I'll discuss the applications of drones in environmental research in general, and we'll explore different sensors and costs. And then we'll look at some examples of drone analyses before we take a deeper dive into the research that I conducted in the Klamath River in Northern California with a drone to look at algae and aquatic plants. And then finally, we'll take a little look at an educational activity that you might be able to do in the classroom. But first, what exactly is a drone? So this is an aerial vehicle with no pilot on board. meaning that it's remotely controlled and it weighs less than 55 pounds, according to the Federal Aeronautics Administration, or the FAA. And there are two main types of drones: a rotorcraft with the propellers up top, as you see on the right, and these can fly on one battery for about 20 to 30 minutes, and a fixed wing drone, which you can see below that, and this can fly on one battery for about an hour. And one of the largest benefits of drone imagery is that it has very high resolution and you can see what satellites cannot. So what do you all think drones can be used for in environmental monitoring? And I want to open this up to the group, so feel free to type this into the chat if you have any ideas. It doesn't have to pertain just to algal bloom monitoring. You can get creative with it. I see one person typing into the chat.
I will directly say, so I would have thought about, something related to forest fires or things like that. Are drones, or maybe it gets burnt, I don't know. Would drones be used for something like that?
One. Yeah. So feel free to, keep typing into the chat, or you can unmute yourself if you want to contribute, no problem. Let's see if there's another one. Yeah, watercolor and quality, definitely. Yeah, so the majority of my talk will be about drones for algal bloom monitoring, but I also wanted to introduce this broader scope of how drones can be used in environmental monitoring before we dive in together. So yeah, forestry, a lot of terrestrial, different types of land cover analyses and things like that too. Let's see if there's another one. Erosion, yeah, definitely. So those were some really great ideas, and I've categorized some of these applications into aquatic or water related and terrestrial or land related studies with drones. So some specific examples include coral reef mapping, water quality samples, tracking whales, as you can see on the upper right, as well as disaster monitoring like fires, as you mentioned, land cover change. Maybe a lot of people use drones for agriculture, tracking mammals like these little elephants that you see on the bottom right, and so much more. So a lot of great ideas, and you might even be able to try out these ideas in your own citizen science research projects. So now let's talk sensors. Here are some of the primary sensors that can be put on drones for environmental research. Our cell phones have RGB, or red, green, blue sensors, and that's what we use to take photos. These are standard digital cameras, and a lot of drones come equipped with RGB cameras, like the drone that I used in my research. Multispectral cameras, as you see in the second on the right, they use the near infrared portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. So they're really good for vegetation monitoring because healthy vegetation reflects light in the near infrared and absorbs light in the red portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. And then we have thermal cameras. That's the third image. And that's also where you see some of my colleagues lit up. So these are great for mammal identification, as you see here, but also for things like water stress. And finally, LiDAR, which is light detection and range, is actually a laser that can measure elevation and height. So it's great for looking at trees and canopy cover. A lot of people use this after fires and big losses of forests after that. You can also use it for underwater surveys to measure bathymetry. So there are a lot of different sensors, can be used for a lot of different projects. And here are a couple examples of analyses that can be done with drones. So people are using multispectral cameras, the ones you see in the near infrared, to identify toxic algal blooms on the water surface, as you see on the far left. And we'll dive more into algal bloom detection very soon. LiDAR can help us see where trees have been logged if you fly before and after the logging and conduct change analysis. And thermal cameras, in addition to tracking elephants and my colleagues, can help us see where crops aren't getting enough water, as you see on the far right. And these images were all acquired with drones. So it's pretty cool to see the diversity of projects that you can do with this type of technology. Now let's talk about costs. So these are the drones that are mainly used for kind of high quality research. However, I also can tell you about some of the other drones that you can start off with in the classroom. I just did a quick search, and there are some really nice drones that are starting around maybe $30 to $50. So you might want to start there if you have some funds for a classroom, but you can see that they get a little bit pricey. Like on the right side, you see that SenseFly EB fixed wing drone on the top, which is $20,000, and the $50,000 LiDAR sensor. So those are going to be pretty expensive. However, you can also get pretty cheap drones and relatively inexpensive sensors, like the RGB camera, that 700 on the left. The multispectral camera is, and this is all US dollars, by the way. That'll get a little bit pricier. Oh, sorry, was there a question?
There's a question.
Somebody is joining.
Okay. There's a question in the chat right now. If you're okay taking it right now, or we can have it at the end.
Yeah, sure. So the question is, how far do you have to be to use a multispectral camera? And that's a really great question, because it just depends on the resolution that you need for your project. So if you have a drone and you can put one of these multispectral cameras on, then, you know, if you can fly even just a few meters above your target, that's really great, because you'll get much higher spatial resolution, just maybe half a centimeter or 1 or 2 centimeters per pixel. So that's great. The higher you fly determines the spatial resolution of your imagery. So if you're flying at 30 meters, which is a very standard height to fly, then your pixel sizes will be slightly bigger, but that's a pretty good spot to fly at. If you're flying at, you know, 100 meters, which might be the legal limit in some locations, you're going to have much coarser resolution, so it'll be harder to determine what you're looking at. Oops. Okay. Yeah, great question. And then for my project, the one that I'm going to talk about in just a moment, I used a Phantom 4 Pro drone. So that's kind of this little DJI Phantom that you see here, which is next to the DJI Mavic on the left. And my whole drone setup was about $1,400 US dollars, which was relatively cheap to conduct a whole scientific research project. But as I said, you can get drones for maybe $50 to experiment with at first.
I have another question for these drones.
Sure.
So, I mean, this cost is just like for the drone itself, like, or is it like with the camera and everything like in there, like?
Yeah, great question. So most of these drones, actually, I believe all of them include a camera. And this camera is an RGB, or the red, green, blue camera. So it's built in. That's what I took all my photos with in terms of the DJI Phantom. DJI Mavic is a great option if you have about $1,000 to spend on a classroom or a project, because the photos are incredible. However, I have a DJI Mavic Air 2, and it's great. The photos are incredible. They're actually better than the DJI Phantom 4 Pro for me. However, they don't have built-in software to run a flight plan, which means it'll take the automatic photos. You just kind of put a shape that you want it to fly in. Usually it's kind of like a zigzag so that you capture all angles. So I had to fly my DJI Mavic Air 2 manually.
Okay.
So that's the only reason why I actually really recommend the DJI Phantom series, because you can do that automatic flight planning.
Got it.
Yeah, great questions. So now that we've had a nice introduction into drones for environmental research, let's switch over to drones for algal bloom monitoring, which is why we're all here. And we'll start from the beginning. So I first became interested in water quality when I was a kid. And here I am in the little orange inner tube next to my cousin. And I used to see this green slimy stuff in the lakes that I used to go to with my family. And I learned that this green slimy stuff was algae, which is extremely important for lakes and riverbeds and all sorts of aquatic environments. However, too much of it can become a problem, as we know. So especially the type of algae that can produce toxins, which can be dangerous for dogs who drink the water and humans who consume shellfish from affected water bodies. So in university, I started making maps and looking at satellite imagery to find algae in lakes. And I realized that drones could do this too. And a couple of reasons why I really love drones are because they're super flexible and fun to fly, but also algal blooms can appear in just hours. They might only last for a few days, and a lot of satellites only pass over maybe once every 16 days, such as Landsat, or once every 5 to 10 days, like Sentinel. And drone imagery can be just centimeters per pixel. So they're really great tools to monitor these events. And now I'm in grad school at UC Berkeley, and I use drones to study algae in Northern California in a river called the Klamath, which you see here. So there's a big proposal to remove 4 hydroelectric dams, like this one called Iron Gate Dam, along the Klamath River in the next couple of years. And they're actually planning to start tearing these down, like this one, in maybe 1 or 2 years. So it's really coming up. And if this happens as planned, it will be the largest dam removal project in human history. So it's very important that we understand how the dam removal will affect the ecology of the river. And it's hard to know how dams will affect aquatic life, especially when we're using traditional monitoring techniques like snorkeling or swimming in the river or taking grab water samples. And this can be dangerous when the river is moving very fast or it's very deep, like this river. So using a drone can really help monitor from above and gain a greater spatial scale of these changes. And so we're using drones to look at how dam removal will impact aquatic life, such as fish habitats and increasing sediments from the removal. And this is a really great way to capture some of these restoration activities and looking at the habitats. And it's also great to look at the river before the dams are removed so we can do a comparison. So my project is mainly looking at the before the dams are removed. All right, perfect. So all of this work is based on a paper that we published last year. And feel free to check this out if you have any questions, more specific questions, or you can always reach out to me if you want to discuss these topics further. And my email's on the very last slide. But for now, let's launch into the Klamath. So here are my study sites. The Klamath River is a very, very productive body of water, meaning it has a lot of algae and aquatic plants. And it starts in the Upper Klamath Lake in Oregon, that big water body on the upper right. And it flows through several dams, which are those little purple triangles. There are 4 dams that you can see there. And then it twists its way through this mountainous terrain, like you can see in that photo on the top left, until it meets the Pacific Ocean in California. And it's important to maintain water quality and habitat there are a lot of tribes that live along the river that use this river for ceremonies and capturing their food. There are a lot of salmon that spawn in this river. And there are 2 great contributors to both water quality and habitat, which are algae and aquatic plants in the Klamath. So that's why I wanted to take a look at these. So there are a lot of primary producers in the river, such as algae and aquatic plants, like this little plankton that you see on the top, which is probably what a lot of you are looking at in your own studies. And then also this benthic algae, which is the stuff that grows on the bottom of the riverbed. So this is really great for maintaining stability of the river, providing food for fish. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So some people consider a lot of the little plankton algae to be sort of bad or toxic algae, while a lot of people might consider more of the benthic habitat to be the good algae. So in my research, I look at the good, the bad, the algae. And today I'm just going to focus on the good, so no toxic stuff in this presentation. However, drones are also fabulous at looking at our bad little plankton on the top of the surface, because most of the time drones can't really see through the water column more than maybe a meter or two. And in this project, one of my questions was, how far can we see underneath the water? And since I was looking at the river at a very clear time of the year, I was able to look down to about 2 to 3 meters. So here we are monitoring the Klamath River with a drone. And this was out in the summer of 2019. I was there for 3 weeks with my field crew, and we were looking at algae, as you can see on the right, as well as aquatic plants. And on the left, you can see my little Phantom 4 Pro that I used in my research. And most of the time I would fly right next to the river, as you can see here, but sometimes there wasn't river access. So I would drive my car and then park and fly from the top and just try and, direct the drone down to the river and fly from there. However, I highly recommend, if it's possible, to fly from the same elevation and at the same altitude every time you're flying, so that you have the same pixel resolution or spatial resolution. So in my project, I had to resample or correct for the spatial resolutions since I was flying at all these different heights. And I see that there's a question in the chat. So how do you avoid the top layer of algae in your collected data? So that's a great question. So in this particular study, the Klamath River has an algae seasonality that I was researching before I went. So usually there's a lot of algal buildup in the springtime, like diatoms. And then as the spring, there's kind of like a purge as a lot of water flows through. So it scours out a lot of that algae. And then in the summer months, a lot of the top layer algae has already flowed off. And then I can see through to the bottom. It was the clearest months are around June and July, which is when we were out. And then right around the end of July, you'll start to see a lot of the more floating algae from July through October. So that's why I really tried to focus on looking at the benthic algae during June and the first part of July, since that's when you can really see it the best. But that's a great question, because as you can see here, there sometimes are floating mats that have been benthic and then they detach and they'll float to the surface. But most of them just stayed on the sides of the riverbank. And I was looking more towards the center and some of the sides of the riverbank. So from June to July in 2019, my colleague snorkeled and swam in 10 reaches of the river to collect the ground data, or should we say river data, while I flew my drone above to collect aerial imagery at the exact same time. So she was swimming back and forth across the river, and I would fly back and forth as she was swimming. And we wanted to collect percent cover, so estimating percent cover of these algae and aquatic species, and looking at the actual species of the algae. So she was collecting that river data, and I was collecting the aerial imagery. Yeah, it's pretty intense. She was very exhausted after about 5 hours of swimming every day. So we would have really nice meals at our campsite. And in the end, we selected the best 32 images from our 10 sites. And then I classified the algae and aquatic plants within the drone imagery. And I compared these classifications to the river data that my colleague collected. And then we calculated percent cover of the algae and aquatic plants throughout all of these sites. So if anyone wants to kind of nerd out right now, I'll tell you about the classification mechanism that we used, which is called Random Trees Classifier. And that's basically random forest, if you're familiar with machine learning algorithms. However, I did this in ArcGIS Pro, so that's why it's called Random Trees. So basically, we just created these training polygons by labeling each image. As you can see on the left, those little dots are, so I'm outlining water, algae, aquatic plants. Basically, I had 6 different classes that I was highlighting in each image. So algae, macrophytes, which are aquatic plants, water, land, shadows, and sun glint. And that's solar reflection. And you can see that on the photo on the left, where the sun is kind of reflecting so much that we actually can't see beneath the surface. And we ended up being able to learn how to correct for that by flying at different times of the day mainly in the morning and afternoon. So we're avoiding directly at noon when the sun is shining right down. And then I classified each of these images with that random trees classifier. And this just takes that random subset of training pixels from our labeled polygons and assigns it a class. So on the right, you can see the random trees classification. There's the regular UAV images on the left and the classification on the right. And this is moving downstream. So you can really see how the river is widening as you move towards the Pacific Ocean. And it's also transitioning from aquatic plants upstream towards more algae downstream. And here are the percent cover estimates of the algae and aquatic plants, which are macrophytes, as we call them here, as we move away from that Iron Gate Dam and towards the Pacific Ocean. So algae increased a ton below Iron Gate Dam as you got closer to the ocean, probably because of nutrients and flow dynamics, which are influenced by those smaller rivers that enter the main Klamath as you get closer to the Pacific Ocean. And these findings will really help us show how a drone can monitor algal growth in response to other processes, like restoration activities and nutrient reduction from dam removal. And we really expect these dams to help clear out a lot of these algae, especially the toxic algae that are in the reservoirs behind the dam. So we're really expecting the dams to improve the water quality of this system. But with drones come tricky situations. So a couple of things to keep in mind when you're flying a drone over water. Step one, try not to crash your drone into the water. We got really lucky here and that never happened, but we did come close a few times. And we actually had some birds try and attack the drone. But if that ever happens, I recommend just flying straight up because that seems to be the fastest way to kind of get away from the birds. Not all birds will attack your drone, just certain birds. And another big issue I encountered is sun glint, as I mentioned before. So that's the sun's reflection on the water's surface. And this, along with wind, as you can see on the right, can make algal detection pretty difficult. It's hard to see below the surface. So if you try and fly with as little wind as possible and avoid flying right at solar noon, so that might be about 1 p.m. in the summertime, at least in this latitude, you'll have less solar glare. So fly anytime between, maybe 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. And that ended up to work. That worked for us. And also there are sometimes obstacles like telephone wires and bridges, as you can see on the bottom right. Those are prime targets for your drone, so just watch out. And since this river really meanders and twists and turns, maintaining line of sight, which is an FAA regulation, can be really challenging. So that's why flying higher can actually help you see more of the river and maintain sight of your drone. But if you're flying at a lake or a pond, hopefully this won't be an issue. So hopefully you'll be able to fly lower so that you get that higher spatial resolution. And again, fly at the same resolution, fly at the same elevation if you can. And remember to charge up your batteries and even bring extras when you're out in the field, because you might not find too many outlets while you're out there. We had to charge our drones at the Pizza Hut. There was a little pizza joint out there. And we would just hang out there for a few hours. And last but not least, if you're truly interested in flying drones for research, or you're doing this for a company, then I recommend you getting your pilot's license, at least in the US. And this is the Part 107 FAA license, and you can take this test at a local airport. And this will give you the training you need to make sure that you're following all local air traffic guidelines and you won't accidentally fly into a commercial airliner. So in conclusion, our study along the Klamath River demonstrated that low-cost red, green, blue drone imagery for about $1,400 is useful and accurate. We had about an 82% classification accuracy rate, which was pretty high for this type of study. For underwater, algae and aquatic plant identification and percent cover estimates. So we were actually able to look about 2 to 3 meters under the water's surface, mainly because this river was pretty clear at the time. And this study can help inform future dam removal restoration efforts. when you're looking at habitats and stream bed stabilization, as well as primary production assessments, and yeah, looking at dam removal itself and how that will affect the algae and aquatic plants. There's some really interesting emerging trends in everything related to drones. So if LiDAR caught your eye, there are many developments in this world, such as bathymetric surveys. So if you're looking at riverbeds or ocean floor, you can use LiDAR for that. It's the green LiDAR. And even structure from motion, which is basically creating a 3D point cloud from your RGB, just your regular red, green, blue camera. And a lot of people are using hyperspectral sensors, which can get very expensive, but they're really helpful. They're, instead of just looking at RGB, which is 3 bands, hyperspectral is hundreds of bands. And that's looking at very discrete sections of the electromagnetic spectrum. So you can really get at the types of algae, the species potentially. Definitely, you can look at genera, and you can look at trees and algae for this type of technology. And when you have a bigger drone, you can put more sensors on it. So some people are putting thermal, RGB, and near-infrared sensors all on one platform. And UAVs are really good at filling in the gaps when satellite imagery cannot resolve surface features. So there's been some nice harmonization and combinations between drones and satellite imagery. And if you're not familiar with satellite imagery, there's a really nice data set that Planet Labs from San Francisco has put out. That's about 3-meter resolution imagery that could really help you in your own project, depending on how big your body of water is. And then there's always Sentinel, which is 10-meter resolution imagery, and Landsat, which is 30-meter resolution imagery, if you have a bigger study site. And finally, like random forest classification method I mentioned earlier, machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence are expanding rapidly. And these can really help us identify things faster and with greater accuracy. So these are just some of the trends that are up and coming, especially for drones and environmental research. And all of this got me thinking, excuse me, why don't we try this type of study with students? So if anyone wanted to adapt these methods to a classroom, here's an example exercise of how you could start monitoring algae near you. So you could first fly a drone at a river, pond, or even a beach, with permission, of course, and take photos of the algae that you find. The drone on the top right is a Mavic Air 2, which I mentioned earlier, and it takes really great photos. So it's about $800 US. And other cheaper drones could also be great, something for maybe $50. You just need to make sure that they come with a camera, or if they're big enough, you could try and put a GoPro on them. I have Velcroed a GoPro to a couple drones. They just have to be big enough to be able to carry the weight. Next, you can print out the best photos that you take onto sheets of paper. So imagine that second image on the right is, something that I printed out. And then make sure that you're choosing photos that don't have much solar reflection, and so you can see the algae pretty well and that aren't blurry. And then you can have students use colorful markers or pens to highlight areas within these photos that have algae or maybe aquatic plants. And you can estimate the percent cover within this body of water by creating a grid using graph paper, as you see in that bottom image. And this exercise can be repeated throughout the semester, and students can graph the percent cover changes to see how algae growth is fluctuating in their study area, possibly in response to an event like a restoration project, or maybe nutrients that are flowing into the system. And a quick plug, if you're interested in learning more about drone mapping, data processing, or analysis, come to Drone Camp. So this is a 4-day short course for drone enthusiasts. No experience is required. And it's in June and July of every year. So it's just a few days, but we have it in the summertime. It's usually in California, but last year it was all online. So if we have an online component, then anyone around the world could join as well. And this is geared for educators, professionals, university students, and anyone interested in knowing how to fly drones and interpret the imagery. So feel free to see this link for more information, and keep checking the website, especially as the dates approach. So here we are back in the Klamath. And to wrap this all up, drones can be really useful tools to monitor changes in aquatic environments like rivers, lakes, ponds, and even marine areas. In my research, I assessed how drones can be used as an alternative to traditional survey methods like swimming and snorkeling through a river, so that we can capture imagery from above and provide information on how aquatic life is responding to restoration activities. And these methods can be adapted to classroom settings, so students can get their hands on understanding how to collect, classify, analyze, and interpret water quality data and imagery. And I'd be happy to continue brainstorming lesson plan ideas. We can discuss how students can become citizen scientists. And I'd also love to talk about this type of research or any drone-related environmental monitoring, or answer questions about Drone Camp. So feel free to email me to get in touch, and looking forward to our discussion. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Chippie. We do have a few questions in the chat. Maybe we can take them one by one. So the first question is it known that other water bodies generally have more algae downstream?
That's a really good question. I guess it might depend on the layout of that water body. I think algae often do appear more frequently downstream as well, especially because so this river that I was studying is often called the upside down river, because it starts in an agricultural area in Oregon, flows through mountains, and then ends up in the ocean. Whereas most rivers start in the mountains, flow through, and end up kind of in an agricultural zone. So there often is a lot of algae downstream in other water bodies because of the nutrient input from these agricultural areas. But I think that is fairly common.
The next question that we have is, which software do you use to perform random tree classification? Is it similar to unsupervised classification?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Thanks so much. So I used ArcGIS Pro, which is just the newer version of ArcGIS Desktop. And that is a proprietary software. A lot of companies have licenses to it. And random trees is basically just like random forest, which you can do on any software pretty much. Like I use R, a lot of people use Python as well. But this is a supervised classification. So I was actually creating the polygons myself, giving the labels, and then running it through the classifier.
The next question we have is, how much data is often generated from your 1 day of study? Is data management an issue here?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so it depends how you're taking photos. So each of my photos, I was taking them manually because I was pretty nervous to run into trees or bridges or telephone wires in the river. And the river meanders so much that it was sort of hard to get a flight plan before I went out into the field. So I ended up taking my own photos. So I didn't take as many as a flight plan would require. A flight plan might take like 100 to 200 photos, depending on how big it is. But by the end of the season, I was getting a lot better at knowing how to take just like maybe just a few photos to get exactly what I needed. But at the beginning, yeah, maybe when I was using a flight plan and testing that out, just even 1 day could take up a few gigabytes just with the photos. And then when you're processing the imagery, you're also creating new products as well. So having an external hard drive, maybe 1 or 2 terabytes, I would highly recommend. But also just kind of exploring and trying everything out before you get into the field, just so you know how to process the imagery and how to manage the data. I would highly recommend that as well.
That's a really good advice. The other question we have is, how much time does it take to cover a lake or a river, and how do you decide the locations along a river? Like, do you already have any prior information about algae or something like that? Or yeah.
Right. Yeah. So in terms of covering a lake, if you wanted to fly an entire lake, that would just depend on how high you're flying. So the higher you fly, the less time it's going to take to capture the entire lake. And it definitely depends on the size of the lake as well. If you're flying lower and closer, you're going to be taking more images and using, it's going to consume more data space as well. But if you're flying high enough, maybe 30 meters or more, you could capture potentially in just a few minutes. But in terms of this river, we actually ended up traveling a couple 100 miles in total.
Wow.
Yeah, so we just had 10 transects that we decided on. And those were actually, I didn't mention this, these were decided based on the environmental monitoring sites of the Karuk tribe that is already taking water quality samples. And they do this at a few different reaches that are accessible to them. And so we wanted to take transects along some of these areas so that we could compare some of the data to their environmental monitoring techniques. So I was able to collaborate with some people from that tribe, and they helped determine some of the locations. But I would say, maybe having each, if you're looking at a river, maybe having each transect a mile apart or something, but it really depends on what sort of dynamics you want to capture. So like we would always go a little bit below a tributary because we wanted to see how that might influence the algae in that distribution. So yeah, you could think about just what the river or lake looks like and how frequently, or the spatial distribution of what you need to capture.
Right. Yeah. Another question we have is, what are the applications of drone monitoring in agriculture?
Yeah, great question. So there are a lot of applications in agriculture, and a lot of people are using thermal cameras and multispectral cameras for that specifically. And I think I can get back to it really quickly. A lot of people look at water stress because they want to know how their plants are responding, to a drought, for example, like you can see on this far right image. So with this thermal camera, which is slightly more expensive than a multispectral camera, you can really see how different watering methods are impacting like the greenness of these plants. A lot of people are using multispectral cameras to look at a ratio called NDVI, or the normalized difference vegetation index, to see kind of green up events of their plants, to see which plants might require more fertilization or fertilizer or water. So yeah, there are a lot of different terrestrial types of projects that people are doing in ag. And I kind of think that's where a lot of the drone research and technology development has started.
Awesome. Yeah, that's good to know. Another question we have is, did you first monitor by other means if the bloom was not harmful across different seasons?
Oh, so did we monitor kind of on the ground to see?
Yeah, I mean, if because you said that you monitored the blooms across different seasons as well, like from June to July versus August to later on, I think that's what they mean. So like, did you already know prior, like in which seasons the bloom was going to be more harmful or not, or something like that?
Yeah, so I was just reading papers based on research that was done in the Klamath River before I went out there, to see, okay, so what is the seasonality of algae? So it really starts with diatoms in the springtime, and then there's a lot of sloughing that happens, so a lot of that algae gets washed away, and then there's kind of that buildup of aquatic plants and cladophora, kind of these rooted algae and macrophytes. And then starting around July, August, September, October is when like microcystin, that's very like microcystis is really common in the system, especially in the reservoirs. And that's actually what I'm studying for my second chapter of my dissertation now. So those are toxic blooms that they often see, and they're doing water quality testing once or twice a month to look at toxins in the reservoirs and in different parts of the river. But yeah, just for this project, I was only looking at the benthic, pretty much the good algae. I wasn't looking too much at the Anabina or any of the toxic species that grow in the main stem.
But you already knew that there were no harmful algae. It's interesting that, you know, benthic versus, as you said, microcystin has like some different seasons.
Yeah, especially in this system. But I was just reading a paper that, you know, across the globe, we're seeing microcystis everywhere on every continent. And now it's not just growing in its typical seasons, it's growing at all times of the year. So it is a good thing to kind of look out for as well.
Yeah, so I mean, our project with our cohort is also like spread through the year. So now, you know, like many people are starting sometime in November or December. So like it's the winter month. And I think like by the time they do like the full circle of a year, they might have like completely different kind or species of algae which they find. Or so we can, that'll be interesting. We have another one of our participants. I don't know their name, but they are Mother of Seaweed on this Zoom call, but they have highlighted a research group in Spain, which are as Drone C on Twitter, who do research with drone. And they also have a question. Is there any open repository of drone images for education purposes?
Yeah, thanks so much, Mother of Seaweed. I love that.
His name is Raquel Sanchez. That's what he says.
Nice.
I hope I'm pronouncing it right.
That's amazing. Yeah, so in terms of open repositories for drone images, I would highly recommend Open Aerial Map. And that's a website that you can go to and you can download drone imagery that's been uploaded by people who are collecting it across the world. And you can find, it's not available for every single location on Earth. It's only people who have uploaded their own drone imagery. Yeah, Open Aerial Map. But I've used that just to test out some of my methods. When I need a drone image, I'll go to like, you know, Monterey Bay in California. There's a lot of drone images around there. And then I'll just run my classifiers and see which one kind of seems to work best for the marine areas or the coastal inland waters. So that's what I'd recommend as a first glance. But I'm also happy to share some of my imagery if anyone wants to play around with that.
Awesome. So yeah, so they say, Raquel says that they teach GIS at a university in Spain. So I mean, yeah, that'll be really great. I think like thanks for the information about Open Aerial Map. And you know, because some of our teachers who were not able to attend because they're at school right now, we would love to share this information and all of this presentation with them. And you know, like, so the cost of drones that you mentioned, like, you know, the cheapest would be in the range of $1,000, let's say, with all the equipments and everything. So I mean, we were thinking like, you know, if we can somehow come up with some sort of strategies once our Frugal Tools things takes off and everything, like how they can collaborate or pool together, you know, resources and things like that. I think this would be really like a good add-on to the work that we're doing to identify on a very visual scale the kind of species that are present or the amount. If you can do like a full map using some, you know, like frugal drones or collaborative drones, that'll be really amazing for the kind of projects that we want to do. So I think Iqbal has a question before I conclude. Yeah.
Hi, Chippie. That was a fantastic talk. Thanks a lot for taking time out for educating us. My question to you is, how difficult is the data analysis? I know I talked about it a little bit, and I'm sorry if I missed it. Is it possible to create a generalized framework so that, you know, once, let's say I do not want to go into the field and drive a drone, right? So what if I'm more interested in the data analysis side of the story? That way I see an opportunity here because, you know, in astronomy, there are plenty of field telescopes and you can get this data virtually, you know, for free. But then there's a community around the data of field telescopes, and they engage in data analysis in the purpose of discovering something unique, some unique celestial events. So, okay, like, what are your thoughts thinking about an analogy like with astronomy here?
Yeah, thanks for that question.
And can I just add to that, coming to Iqbal's question, it's a wonderful point. I was wondering with the open aerial map thing you told us about, could we use it as an open source for images and then, maybe take out some useful information out of that since it's already available?
Yeah.
And are people uploading there who are mostly doing it for a hobby or something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are really great questions. And I'm really happy to hear that, at least in the astronomy community, there is some open data access and sharing. But it's a really good question. I think this is actually a tough part of working with drone imagery because it does consume so much space that, a lot of people don't upload their own their drone imagery to Open Aerial Map or other. I haven't found too many other kind of collective data websites besides like GitHub and things like that, where people might just share their own personal repositories. But yeah, I think once people create like an actual map, maybe like a GeoTIFF or something like that from their images, that's an easier thing to share. But I don't often see like a full collection of drone imagery. But there are some examples online that I've seen just when people are trying to work with certain sensors, and then they'll give you some example imagery. But I think this would be a really great way to move forward in terms of figuring out how to share drone imagery or how to pick a subset for sharing drone imagery. And to the point of the classification component, it can be a little bit tricky to dive into. But there are a lot of resources. I know Esri, which is the company that makes the ArcGIS software, they have some training modules, as does NASA RSET. That's a really great training organization that has some really great ways to classify imagery, like in Google Earth Engine, for example, but that's mainly using satellite imagery. You could upload your own images, but that's more satellite platforms like Sentinel and Landsat. So there are some kind of training webinars for the classification part. But yeah, I would say machine learning is seems to be the way of the future for these classifications, and supervised classification so far has seemed to be higher accuracy with this topic in particular. But yeah, in terms of making this all open source, I think moving towards open source software like Jupyter Notebooks and R has been really helpful in that regard. Unfortunately, my project is all in ArcGIS Pro, but that's kind of a user-friendly way to get introduced to this topic.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, this was really, really great. I mean, I'm just going to open, it's already 10 o'clock, but if there are any other questions, we can take it last minute. Otherwise, we can conclude. I think this was really, really good. Thank you so much for taking out the time for this, Chippie. Really, really appreciate it. And I'm pretty sure, I think like our students and teachers, once we share this recording with them, it'll be really beneficial, and it'll really encourage us to think how we can, maybe like starting off with some imagery, as you suggested, like open aerial maps and things like that might be helpful. And then sort of having, some sort of a collaborative environment in schools to share these resources together. That'll be really, really awesome. So yeah, thank you so much. And I think if we have more questions from our teachers and everything after this talk, is it okay if I send you an email or something?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for all the great questions.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
You can stop the recording, Kanika.